Well, Paul says in the New Testament that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control. And we're going to start that little sequence with one word out of that sequence in Galatians 5:22, kindness. We're going to think about kindness. So where do you go in the Bible if you want to think about kindness? There's lots of places you could go, but we're going to go to a little book tucked away in the Old Testament between the books of Joshua and 1 Samuel. It's 4 chapters, and it's the story of Ruth. And as we'll see, Ruth is really about 3 things. It's about the resilience of some amazing women. It's about the kindness of an amazing man called Boaz. And it's about something else as well. Over all of that, it's about something else, and we'll get to that at the end. But just for now, let me tell you the story of Ruth. This happened about 3,000 years ago. So this is in the late Bronze Age, at the beginning of the Iron Age, 3,000 years ago. And a lady called Naomi is a citizen of Israel, lives in Bethlehem. We'll come to that later too. And she's married to a man called Elimelech. And the story of Ruth tells us that there was a famine in the land. And it got so bad that Elimelech and Naomi left Israel. They left Judah and they went to Moab, which is just across the Jordan Valley to the east. Today we would say that Moab is kind of Jordan, that sort of area, the kingdom of Jordan. But in those days, Moab was a proverbial enemy of Israel. So for a lot of people, the Moabites, you didn't mix with them. The Moabites, you didn't have anything to do with them because they had a long history with Israel and it wasn't a good history. So going to Moab, they were taking a bit of a chance. And they spent altogether 10 years in Moab. During the course of that, Elimelech died. And Naomi's 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, had married Moabite women, a woman called Ruth and a woman called Orpah. And her sons died, Naomi's sons died. And that left the 3 women together after that 10-year sojourn in Moab. And that was the point at which Naomi decided that it was time to return to Bethlehem. So they pack up their belongings and they set out. They travel west and they aim to cross the Jordan Valley, cross the Jordan River, back into the land of Judah. As they're approaching her home country, Naomi stops the little group and she says to her daughters, "Look, don't you come. You stay with your own people. If you come with me, you'll have to learn a different language. You'll have to learn different customs. You'll be foreigners in a strange land, and that might not be a pleasant experience for you. Go back to your own country, and I'll go on alone." Now, Orpah decided that that was good and wise, and she turns around and she goes back into Moab. But Ruth doesn't. Ruth says this, and this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. I will go wherever you go and live wherever you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I will die where you die and will be buried there. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." So that's Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, and the few verses that follow. So Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem, where Naomi would have had an estate, a little plot of land and a place to live. But it's 10 years since this land was cultivated. It's 10 years since anybody put a lick of paint on the doorposts and on the window frames. So the house, I imagine, is a ruin. It's a place where animals live. And her land will just be a thicket of weeds. And here they are, 2 women. They've got no land to live off. They are, in effect, destitute. Now, this is when we come across Universal Credit, Old Testament style. Except it was better than Universal Credit. It was written into God's law that when you harvested a field, whether it was grain, like wheat or barley, or whether it was grapes, vines, or olives, the stuff that fell on the ground you weren't allowed to pick up. And you weren't allowed to harvest to the edge of the fields because you were meant to leave that for the poor. And the poor of the parish would come and they would pick up the bits that were left by the harvestmen, and they would pick up the bits on the edges of the field. That was called gleaning. So Naomi wasn't able to do this. She was too old and infirm. So Ruth did that for her and Naomi. So she went into the fields and she began to glean. At this point, she encounters, at a distance at first, this amazingly kind man called Boaz. Now, Boaz sees Ruth working hard to support her mother-in-law, and he instructs his harvest people to leave a bit of extra for Ruth and not to give her a hard time. In fact, one of the things you notice about chapter 2, of Ruth, is that actually gleaners weren't often given a kindly reception. So Ruth is told in chapter 2, verse 21, stay with the harvesters until the entire harvest is completed. Stay with these workers right through the whole harvest. You'll be safe there, unlike in the other fields. There are 2 hints in chapter 2, if you read it afterwards, 2 hints that Ruth would have had a hard time if she'd gone anywhere else. By the end of chapter 2, it's pretty clear that Boaz has warmed to Ruth. It's also pretty clear that Naomi is pushing Ruth in the direction of Boaz. So there's a strange incident in chapter 3 where all the men involved with the harvest, they're sleeping on the threshing floor, which is the place you beat out the wheat to get rid of the chaff and keep the grains. The men are sleeping on the threshing floor. Boaz wakes up early in the morning to find Ruth sleeping at the foot of his feet. And we don't know why, but this was some kind of signal that Ruth was open to a partnership with Boaz. Boaz was more than open to a partnership with Ruth. I think he'd really set his sights on her. But there was a problem. And the problem was that in those days, if the land fell into disuse or a family couldn't manage its land anymore, a relative of that family could redeem the land, buy the land, and keep it in work, keep the land working for people. And Boaz says, look, I can do this for you because I'm a relative of yours, but there's a closer relative who's got first dibs. So in chapter 4 of Ruth, you see Boaz negotiating with the man who's got first dibs. It's interesting the way he does it. He says, I got this fantastic piece of land. Oh, yeah? Really? He said, yeah. And how much is it? Well, you can buy it. You get first dibs before me because you're the kinsman redeemer. And the man's very, very interested until late in the discussion. Boaz says, oh, by the way, there's this woman Ruth you've got to marry as well. The guy backs off. He's a little bit chary about taking on another wife. So Boaz gets the chance to marry Ruth. And he does. And towards the end of chapter 4, you see this story ending happily ever after in the richest possible sense of that word, because not only does Ruth get a husband and land and a living, and Naomi gets a son-in-law and a daughter-in-law, but Ruth has a child, and the child's name is Obed. And Obed has a child in the fullness of time, and his name is Jesse. And Jesse's youngest son was a man called David, and David was the ancestor of the Savior of the world, the Lord Jesus Christ. This little story fits into the big story of what God is doing in human history, and it's the story of 3 very resilient women, 1 extremely kind man, and something else on top of that as well. We'll come to that in a minute. So that's the story of Ruth. A man called Philip Pullman, who's an evangelistic atheist, really, once said in an interview that he thinks the Bible contains the most beautiful stories in the world. And if the Bible contains those, then Ruth is one of the most beautiful stories, because it's one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible. So what does it mean? What's it about? Well, as I said, it's about the resilience of 3 amazing women through drought and bereavement and loss and long journeys challenging circumstances. Just think about this for a minute. Challenging circumstances. In a famine, the whole nation is under the cosh. In some famines in the ancient Near East, many nations were under the cosh, much as it seems we are now. But this God we serve, this God we worship, has a plan. He is in control. That's not to say he causes your suffering personally and individually, like a sniper with a rifle. He's got you in his crosshairs. That's not the way it works. The world is broken, and out of the brokenness of the world, God can bring something beautiful. That's part of what this is about, the resilience of these women bringing about the purposes of God. There's a second thing as well. We're thinking about kindness, and we're thinking about the kindness of Boaz. But let's start not by thinking about the kindness of Boaz, but by thinking of the reaction perhaps of other people in Bethlehem. As they see this couple, this two women, dragging their way up the hill towards the village. And they look at these two figures, and they have no idea who they are until eventually somebody rumbles, somebody recognizes, that's Naomi. Naomi, yes, that's right, that's Naomi. Do you remember? She went to Moab with her husband. That's right. And I heard that their sons had married Moabite wives. Did you hear that? Yeah, that's right. And here they are, dragging their way back to Bethlehem and expecting us to look after them because things aren't good for them. Their husbands have died. Who did they think they are? They've broken God's law. They've gotten exactly what they deserve. What are they doing coming back here? You can imagine that reaction, because actually they had broken God's law. In the law of God, the first 5 books of the Bible, it's very clear. You shouldn't marry foreigners, and you shouldn't marry the Moabites. Now, this wasn't racist. Later in the Bible, it's very clear. Every tribe, tongue, and nation are going to be embraced in God's kingdom. But for this particular moment, God is keen to keep this particular group of people as pure as he can. So it's a temporary situation in human history. You're not meant to do that. You get what you deserve. And the men in the fields who are harvesting, working their socks off, who are these people who come and pick up the corn? Why can't they go and work somewhere else? What's wrong that they can't be working in their own fields? Why should we have to support them? You can almost feel the resentment when you read the story of Ruth. And Boaz's view is very, very different. And he makes it clear that his men are going to look after Ruth. Ruth pushes him and says, "Why are you doing this?" And he says, "I know about the love and kindness that you've shown to my mother-in-law, your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers." Now get this verse. This verse is the key. Chapter 2, verse 12. "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, reward you fully." May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, reward you fully. In Boaz's head, whatever Ruth and Naomi's past was, here are two people who've come to the Lord for refuge, and he's going to do whatever he can to support them and to help them. That's kindness. It's kindness, yes, towards people you love. That's easy, Jesus says. It's kindness towards people you don't know very well. That's more difficult. It's kindness towards people that perhaps others in the community shun because A, they're getting their just desserts, and B, they're not from round here, are they? So when we think about the kindness of Boaz, we're thinking about someone who's extending kindness to others that wouldn't naturally be the object of his kindness because these people have come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Now, this church, this building, this community is a place where people that others might despise, it's a place where people come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. because he's the one we worship and he's the one we love. And he's the one we want to imitate. That brings me to the third big thing I've hinted at but not mentioned yet. This book is about the kindness and mercy and grace of the God of Israel. Every year, Israel, the Jewish people, remember the giving of the law. Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Tents. Every year, when they celebrate the giving of the law, they read the book of Ruth. Why? Why, of all the books in the Old Testament, would we read this book? For this reason. Because even Old Testament Jews know that God's grace, God's mercy, God's kindness triumphs over law. That at the end of time, human history is about God's grace more than it's about God's law. That we as a community, we don't meet to celebrate how perfect we are. We meet to celebrate how gracious He is. Jesus didn't die on a cross to give us a new set of rules. Jesus died on a cross to set us free to experience God's love, God's kindness, and God's grace. That means if I'm a follower of Jesus, if I'm a Christian, then I'm going to be a little fountain of His grace into other people's lives. Kindness to the people I love. Now that's easy, but do it. Kindness to the people I don't like. That's more difficult. Let's do it. Kindness to the people who are getting their comeuppance, getting what they deserve, but let's do it because that's what God does. Kindness to the people who don't belong here because they're not from round here. Let's do it because that's who God is. And the right call of being and living as a Christian is to live and to be the way this gracious God is. The book of Ruth. And where it fits in the Bible's whole story is about the kindness and the love of God. The kindness and the love of God. Almost done. One last story. Early in World War II, when Britain alone stood in opposition to Nazi Germany, and things were looking extremely grim, our lifeline was our relationship with the United States of America. Because if there was ever going to be any resources or the help that we needed, the allies that we needed to get out of the mess we were in, the USA would provide that lifeline. But the USA weren't keen to join the war. They were quite happy just to stand at a distance until Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. Then there was a discussion between the American and the British governments about how they were going to tackle this international threat of Nazism. And there was a moment towards the end of these negotiations when the American ambassador visited Chequers, visited the Prime Minister Churchill's country residence. There'd been a long weekend of discussions, and the ambassador of the USA was going to go back to his own embassy in London. And as he left, he went down the steps of Chequers, he turned round, and he said these words to Winston Churchill. "I will go wherever you go. I will live wherever you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And I will die where you die and be buried there. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us."